Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the introduction there, Kerry. Yes, I'm Doug McCann from the Evidence Centre, and I'm here today to talk to you about the educational insights into children in care. Now, essentially what I'm just going to talk about is a few sort of like trends and kind of like general insights that we saw from if we look at the data, what does the educational perspective look like if we're just like focusing in on children in care? So let's launch into it, shall we? So first off, I'm just going to have here the IDI disclaimer. So we are going to be using data here today that came from the IDI. And this is just generally to let you know that there isn't any identifiable information in here, and also these aren't necessarily official statistics as a result. Now, a lot of the data is actually sourced from Oranga Tamariki's children's wellbeing model that we built in the IDI. Now, essentially, this wellbeing model was developed for the formation of Oranga Tamariki to provide a measurement backbone. It was really so that Oranga Tamariki could kind of understand what do children's well-being actually really look like, rather than just what our organization sees about them, but what can we see from a kind of wider perspective. And through consultation with multiple organizations and government agencies over the course of several years, we came up with a sort of conceptual idea of what well-being looked like. And that sort of is broadly held in the model under these 5 well-being domains. So you've got sort of safety, children are safe and feel safe; security, that's sort of financial resource security; connectedness, that's do children know where they belong and how they connect to each other and their culture; wellness, which is broadly a health domain. Essentially, it's like, are children mentally and physically healthy? And then you've got development, and this is broadly the education domain. That's like, do children have the skills and aspirations, skills and knowledge they have in order to achieve their aspirations? Now, because we needed this sort of broad view of not just like some piece of data here, some piece of data there, to actually really get this full conceptual idea of well-being, we had to build the model in Stats New Zealand's integrated data infrastructure, the IDI. Now, just for anyone who's maybe not so familiar with what the IDI is, it's basically a giant database that Stats New Zealand holds with almost everyone in New Zealand in it. And they're all anonymized within there. They just have a random ID, and you can't actually identify who anyone actually is. But from the IDI, you can see a lot of microdata. You can see the various interactions an individual's had with multiple government organizations and and departments over the course of their life, going back years and years and years. So it allows the opportunity to do a large-scale modeling of large populations and to really sort of understand what the full kind of life course and interaction of an individual looks like. So we use the data in the IDI to feed up into all these various domains and creates a whole bunch of indicators. So there's data in there from Oranga Tamariki, there's data from justice, data from MSD, health, education, and multiple organizations. So you get that kind of full picture. But today we're going to focus in on that development domain, the one that is education, because we're interested in the educational aspects of children in care. So first up, what we're going to do is, from the model, we pulled out essentially all 5 to 17-year-old children at a particular point in time, those who are like eligible basically to be engaged with education. And we looked at one population, which was all children who were in the care of Oranga Tamariki currently at that point in time. And then we took another population, all those who had no care experience whatsoever with Oranga Tamariki, to provide a comparison group. Now here we just have a little bit of demographic information, and as you can see from the age profile graph there, basically the in-care population and the no-care history population broadly very similar. They have the same age breakdown, so there's not much difference going on there. It's a bit of a different story when you look at the ethnicity makeup of those two populations. Now, ethnicity as defined in the model is self-reported. So what we look at is, what is it that you said your ethnicity was? What do you identify with? And so that's sources like the census, education, health, things like that. So if you said, and we have 4 broad categories essentially. If you said you were Māori, we consider you to be Māori. If we said you were Pacific, we consider you to be Pacific. However, if you said you were Māori and Pacific in one or multiple sources, we have a 3rd category called Māori and Pacific, because we don't believe we should say which one you identify with most if you've reported it in multiple sources. And then we have New Zealand, European, and multiple other ethnicities in a broad other ethnicity category. Now, if you look at the no-care history population, broadly that looks similar to the majority of New Zealand population, 21% Māori, 10% Pacific, and 4% crossover Māori and Pacific. However, it's quite a different picture when you look at the in-care population. There's a large overrepresentation of Māori in the care population. You have 55% of kids in care are Māori, with a further 8% who are Māori and Pacific. So there is a large disparity that exists there in these two populations. We're interested in what does the educational engagement of these two populations actually look like, the in-care population versus the no-care experience population. Now, the easiest way actually to see what educational engagement might look like in the idea is actually look at things that might break that engagement that you're having with education. So we're going to focus in on like 5 sort of disruptive indicators, as it were. Like we're going to look at like how many what proportion of these populations had standouts in the past year, what proportion of them were suspended in the last year, like formally removed until a suspension meeting was held. How many had truancy in the last year? That's between what has been defined 1 and 83 calendar days truant within the schooling year. High truancy, those who've had more than 84 days in the last school year. And then, of course, we're looking at alternative education as well. And this is essentially if you're enrolled in education where mainstream schooling is no longer to actually meet your needs. So if we look at these 5 indicators and compare these 2 populations we're looking at, we actually see quite an interesting picture here. We see that essentially the care population has a very high representation in all of these educational disruptive indicators. What you can see is, like, for instance, in the last year, 9% of the children in care had been stood down from school as opposed to only 1% of the no care experience population. 6% of them had low to moderate truancy last year as compared to only 2% in the no care population, and 4% had high truancy compared to only 1%. So you see there is a large disproportionate representation of children in care in all these indicators compared to the no care experience population. Now, it's important to note, though, at this point, that this graph is not saying that because you are in care, therefore you have poor educational engagement. What you need to understand is that when a child is having to be brought into care, they come from a pretty bad situation. They've essentially had a pretty tumultuous life course that's led them to a kind of crisis state where they've needed to be taken into the care of Oranga Tamariki. Now, so generally the well-being of children just before they come in care looks very poor in comparison to the rest of the population who has no care experience. So there's a lot of other correlating factors here that could be contributing to this large disparity that we're seeing. Now, the thing is, we can actually dig a little further down into these indicators. What does this look like if we look at how this plays out across age groups? So we're going to focus on 2 indicators, stand-downs in the last year and low to moderate truancy in the last year. And we basically looked at what proportion of 5 to 9-year-olds, 10 to 13-year-olds, and 14 to 17-year-olds in these populations have displayed these indicators. So if you look at the stand-down graphs here, you can see 5 to 9-year-olds in care, 4% of them have been stood down last year. Now, stand-downs are a relatively rare event at the best of times, but 4% is a quite high proportion, especially when you compare it to the no care experience population, where you can see it's practically non-existent. And then if you go to the next age group, 10 to 13 years up, you see it escalates very strongly to 11%, and then again to 12% in the 14 to 17-year-old population. So there seems to be this large escalation with age, especially in comparison to the no care population. And you see a similar behavior going on in the low to moderate truancy. Again, 3% in the 5 to 9-year-old group for care, and then it jumps to 6% and 11%. So there's this escalation with age, and it's almost diverging away from the sort of representation you get in the no care history population. So essentially what this is sort of highlighting is like educational sort of disengagement is happening for very young children in care. And it's then just escalating further with age. So there's an opportunity to get involved as early as possible, try and wrap around support and try and stabilize their education at a young age, because it's only going to get worse as they age through the system, essentially. Now, we can also break this down by another way. What if we looked at how this plays out across ethnicity? So here we have stand-downs in the last year, low to moderate truancy in last year by our 4 ethnicity categories. Now, I'd like you to focus on the no stand-downs in the last year and the no care history graph here. Now, you can see there is a pretty clear correlation going on with ethnicity here. If you look at the other ethnicity category, less than 1% have had stand-downs. Then it jumps up to 2% for Pacific, then jumps up again for Māori and Pacific, and jumps up to Māori. So there's sort of this trend going on with ethnicity here for this indicator. But what's interesting is you don't see that same trend mirrored in the in-care population. You see, yes, relatively high levels of stand-downs last year across these ethnicity groupings, but in fact, they're all at a sort of relatively similar level. There's not as much of a sort of trend going on there. So ethnicity doesn't seem to correlate in quite the same way for the care population. Interestingly enough, on this one, the Pacific population has a 4%, which is quite low. But this one probably might be treated with a little bit of caution, because when you talk about Pacific children in care who then has stand-downs, just trying to talk about quite small numbers. So the sample size is getting a bit small, so there might be a bit of variance in that percentage. You also see sort of similar sort of non-mirroring going on with ethnicity in the low to moderate truancy. You see that while Māori and Pacific have relatively like similar levels in the no care history population, those with other ethnicity, very low levels of low to moderate truancy. Yet once you go over to the in-care population, you see much higher again, but there's a bit of variance at the top, but relatively flat, around the same level for most of them. So again, ethnicity is not quite correlating the same way here. Now, if we're talking about educational engagement, we always want to talk about stability in schooling as well. That's always a major kind of like aspect of this. So what we wanted to look at is we wanted to look at school changes for these two populations. So if you look at how did any of these, what was the proportion of these populations that had a school change in the last year, you can see that 22% of children in care had a school change in the last year, as opposed to only 6% of those with no care history. So it's indicative that there is a bit of schooling instability in the last year, as it were. But this is just one recent school change. What happens if we looked at multiple school changes? So let's look at how many school changes you've had over the course of your life. So we looked at how many had 3 or more school changes over the lifetime. And 25%, a quarter of children in care, had 3 or more school changes in their lifetime, as opposed to only 3% of the no care history population. Now this is a pretty stark wide difference here, and so it's showing, and what's even more stark is when you consider the fact that we've actually adjusted this and removed those school changes which are necessary. We removed intermediate to secondary, we removed primary to intermediate. So these are actually a real representation of actual school changes that an individual is going through. So there does seem to be a bit of schooling instability going on with this population. And of course, no education argument is complete without looking at achievement. So we looked at basically all 18 to 19-year-olds in the model and compared those with care experience versus those with no care experience. And what you can see is, again, quite a stark picture. Essentially, children in care do not achieve anywhere near to the same level as children not in care. In fact, 45% of children with care history achieve no NCA level qualifications whatsoever, as opposed to only 16% of those with no care experience. Now, you can start to unpick this sort of story a little bit more when you actually consider what age children might have left school at. For instance, in the care history population, 37% of them had left school at age 15 or 16. And that's compared to only 10% of those with no care experience. So it's looking like perhaps those in care just weren't necessarily at school long enough to achieve NCA levels, because they were 4 times more likely to have left school by these ages than the non-care population, which sort of, again, maybe harkens back to that sort of schooling stability thing we saw on a previous slide. And it's also very interesting if you actually break down achievement by ethnicity. So what we have here is a graph showing the proportions of these populations who achieved NCA level 2 or more by ethnicity. Now, if you look at the no care history graph, you can see there is a trend with ethnicity going on here. Māori have some of the lowest levels of achievement. Only about 68% of them achieved NCA level 2. Then that steps up to Māori and Pacific 70%, Pacific 75%, and other at 81%. Yet when you look at the care history graph there, you see that the differences in ethnicity almost shrink to absolutely nothing. You don't have that sort of same correlation with ethnicity at all there. It seems if you're in care, you achieve essentially at the same rate regardless of your ethnicity, which might be indicative that by the time you've reached the sort of like situation where you need to be in care, that sort of becomes the kind of overriding factor that determines your educational achievement at that point. Like the situation around you is at such a state that all kids in care sort of achieve equally, as it were. So it might make a good case that children in care might need that sort of extra support, extra wraparound services, because they're all equally as in need of assistance in this area. Now, we've looked at children here, we've looked at children without care, but we want to know maybe a little bit more. What happens if you've been in care for quite a long period of time? Let's say you've spent 2 or more years altogether in care. Now, this could have been a consecutive block, this could have been a couple of blocks over the course of life. We're just looking to see, had you been in care for over 2 years in your life? And what you see is you see a little bit of a change here. While children who spent 2 or more years in care still have relatively high levels of these disengagement indicators, it is improved from the general in-care population. There are only 7% of them are being stood down rather than 9%. Only 3% of them have high truancy rather than 4%. So that's quite interesting. And if you look into the school stability aspect as well, let's see, what do the school changes look like? Again, you see an improved picture. you see that school changes in the last year is only 13%. It's like still quite high compared to the no care population, only 6%, but it's improved over the no care population. So it looks like in recent years, children who spend a lot of time in care have had more school stability. Of course, if you look at the 3 or more school changes, it's still relatively high, but potentially this could have happened further in their past. But there is looking like there is a bit more stability for this population. And when you look at the educational achievement picture of it, children who spend 2 years in care still don't achieve anywhere near as well as those who have no care history. However, they are slightly improved over the in-care population at a point in time. You see that 42% of them, more of them are achieving NCA levels than were in the in-care population. And coupled with the fact that you actually see only 32% of them have left school by age 15 or 16, this is again improved over the care population. So we're starting to see that kind of aspect, that maybe they're staying in school for a little bit longer, maybe they have less school changes. So it might be a bit of schooling stability involved here that would be a very interesting story to sort of dig in further and unpick to see if that is perhaps the reason why this is going on. Now, finally, another interesting thing you can do with the model is you can look at sort of like life outcomes for a modeled population, essentially. Because the IDI contains a vast array of historical information for adults going all the way back to their child years, you can see what do populations that have certain sort of interactions in their childhood look like in the future, essentially. So here we have basically a graph that's showing the proportions that are involved in life outcomes. So participation in education, employment and training up to at age 20, long-term benefit and dependency up to age 25, and regular offending up to in your early 20s as well. And generally what you see is if you have care experience, you have generally poorer outcomes. You have lower proportion of them end up participating in education and training and employment. You have a higher proportion on long-term dependency and a higher proportion on going on to regular offending. But we're interested in the education aspect of this. What happened? So we thought, what does it look like if we focused on those who achieved NCA level 2 versus those who didn't achieve NCA level 2 in these two populations? And what you actually see is that, for instance, in the care population, if you achieved NCA level 2, this dark blue bar, you had a much higher proportion went on to have participation in employment, education, and training. A much lower proportion, 26%, dropped down to 13%, who ended up on long-term benefit dependency in their early 20s. And 8% of the care population dropped to 5% in the regular offending category. But interestingly enough, you see that exact same trend being mirrored in the no care experience population. So achievement of NCA level 2 appears to enable better life outcomes, and there could be a number of reasons that are sort of contributing to this, but it would be something very interesting to sort of dig into a little more and find out what is necessarily sort of going on in this aspect here. So after all that, I just want to throw up a few conclusions for you here about some of the things we've talked about today. Essentially, we've seen that children in care basically have higher levels of educational disengagement, and this tends to escalate with age across the indicators. And you also they have lower educational achievement than non-care experienced children. Ethnicity also doesn't appear to correlate quite as strongly in the care population as in the non-care population, both in the indicators and also in the educational achievement. We also saw that children who spend longer in care seem to have better educational engagement and achievement, and the fact that this was seen to be coupled with less school changes and a higher proportion leaving school later in later years maybe suggests that there's a possible stability aspect that needs to be investigated. And finally, we looked at modeled life outcomes, and these were basically showing that these outcomes are better for children who have no care experience as to those who did have care experience. However, this was improved if they managed to achieve NCA level 2 regardless of whether they had care experience or not. So thank you very much for that, and we'll be passing over to Karen in a moment, and she'll be telling you about those all those interviews they had with children about their experiences, which should be very interesting, I think. Thanks.